They turned one of our own into a weapon. We turned him back into a man. The stars above Metropolis did not care about the election. They hung there the way they always had, indifferent, ancient, burning their cold light down through the atmosphere onto a planet that had once been called Earth before the council decided that name carried too much weight, too much history, too much war. They renamed it Metropolis 30 years ago, as if a new name could seal shut all the old wounds, and mostly it had worked. The city-state sprawled across the northern continent in a lattice of clean transit tubes and vertical gardens and low-humming power conduits. And the people who lived there, all 11 billion of them, had grown accustomed to the strange luxury of not dying. They had Nick Darien to thank for some of that. Not all of it, but some. He was not a tall man, and he was not a young one anymore. 42 with the postures of someone who had been in too many pressure drop corridors and carried it in his lower back ever since. He kept his hair regulation short because he had been in the Metropolis Security Force for 19 years, and old habits were the only ones that stayed. He drank his morning ration of synthetic coffee black without ceremony, standing at the window of his bunk in the central security tower, and watching the sun come up over the transit hub and thinking about the briefing he was going to have to give in 20 minutes. The briefing was not going to be good. He had been turning the intelligence over in his head since the middle of the night, when the first fragment of it had come through on his secure channel and snapped him out of sleep with the particular clarity that bad news carries. In the small hours, he had read it 3 times, then read it again, then sat in the dark for an hour with his coffee going cold in his hands, assembling what it meant. What it meant was, they were out of time. The SIGS Institute breach had happened at 0300 hours. 3 security officers dead, Marchetti, Park, and Velez. Names he had learned by the time he was drinking his first cup and would carry for the rest of his life the way you carry names that end on your watch. The Capitron vault had been emptied with a surgical precision that no amateur operation produced. The Ghost Transit signature on Vector 9 was gone before the perimeter alert triggered. Whoever had done it had known the response intervals and planned around them. That level of operational knowledge meant inside information. It meant someone who had been watching them for a long time. It meant Graal. "You look like you haven't slept," said the voice from the doorway. He turned. Barbara Gibson was standing there in the corridor, her security clearance badge catching the early light, her arms crossed in that particular way she had, not defensively, but like she was holding herself still. She was the chief research consultant to the Great Brothers Council, and she had 3 advanced degrees in xenobiochemistry. And she had been the one, 4 years ago, who had flagged the early-stage Capitron experiments and gotten the whole program shut down. She had also been the one who had refused to let Nick thank her for it, on the grounds that she had only done what any sane person would have done, and that gratitude for basic decency was a little embarrassing. Nick liked her very much. "I haven't slept," he said. "Come in. Tell me you have something." She came in and stood beside him at the window and looked out at the city the way she always looked at data, methodically left to right, as if the city were a table of results and she was checking for anomalies. "Lord Graal," she said. "It's him. The breach at the Sigma Institute last night. 3 security officers dead, the Capitron vault emptied, a Ghost Transit signature heading outbound on Vector 9, it's him." Nick set his coffee down. He had known this was coming for the better part of a year. Lord Graal had not exactly been quiet about his intentions from his exile satellite, the broadcast manifestos that the Council tried to suppress and mostly failed to, the midnight transmission to the Great Brother demanding recognition as co-ruler, the single sentence he had sent directly to Nick's personal channel 6 months ago that read simply, "I remember all your faces, but knowing something is coming and having it arrive are 2 different weights." And Nick felt the difference now, settling into his chest like lead. "Vector 9, he said. "That's the Noxon corridor." "Yes, Craspin is on Noxon. He's been there for 2 years. The Exile archives have him listed as deceased, but the biometric scans we pulled from the Sigma breach match his lab protocols. The patterns, the angles of cut on the storage seals, it's his work. He and Graal have been in contact for longer than we knew." She moved away from the window toward his desk and pulled up the holographic display, keying in the data from her own analysis that she had clearly been running through since before she came here. The Sigma breach wasn't opportunistic. It was the 3rd phase of something. The first phase was Graal's contact with Craspin, which we can now date back at least 18 months, based on the communication ghost trails. The second phase was establishing the Noxon facility, equipping it, bringing in materials. This phase, the Capitron, this is them moving to execution. Nick looked at the data on the display. He had always trusted Barbara's analysis because she did not embellish and she did not catastrophize. She assembled evidence with the same patient precision she brought to everything. If she was saying execution, it was because the evidence said execution. What does Craspin need the Capitron for, he asked, though he already knew, somewhere underneath the question, what she was going to say. Barbara turned from the window and looked at him directly, and that was when he knew it was as bad as he'd feared. She had a very specific expression for the truly bad things. Her face did not become more emotional. It became more still, like a surface that had been asked to hold a weight and was deciding whether to. What he always wanted it for, she said, the conversion program, the humanoid project. I wrote the analysis on it 5 years ago. I said it was theoretically possible but practically unconscionable and should be classified at the highest level. The Great Brother agreed with me. The program was mothballed, but the data was never destroyed. Craspin had copies. She paused. He's had 5 years to develop them further. What does conversion look like in practice? Nick asked. Walk me through it. You take a human subject, ideally someone with exceptional baseline physiology, strong musculature, dense bone structure, elevated pain threshold. You expose them to a focused Capitron burst, a missile, most likely, triggered at close range. The radiation doesn't destroy tissue, it rewrites it. Cellular structure reorganizes according to the parameters encoded in the Capitron charge. The nervous system reroutes around normal pain and fatigue responses. The body becomes, effectively, unkillable by conventional means. Conventional weapons won't penetrate the converted skin. The physical strength increases by an order of magnitude. The higher cognition diminishes significantly, not destroyed but pushed back, suppressed. She stopped. And if you implant a control chip in the prefrontal cortex during the transformation window, you get an obedient weapon. You get a humanoid, a person-shaped thing that used to be a person and now isn't, or rather, that still is, in there somewhere, but can't reach the surface. The city outside the window looked exactly the same as it always had. The transit hub filling up. The morning light on the vertical garden panels. The routine, unremarkable, precisely precious life of 1 billion people who hadn't yet started their day. How many could he make, with what he took from Sigma? With individual conversion missiles, directed at individual subjects? Dozens. But that's not what the Capitron from the Sigma Vault was designed for. She paused again, and this pause had a different quality. A measured quality, as if she were choosing how to release the weight of it. The Sigma Vault contained dispersal-grade Capitron. A different formulation, designed for warhead delivery. If Craspin has built a dispersal warhead and given 18 months of preparation, I have no reason to believe he hasn't. He could fire it over Metropolis and convert the entire impact radius simultaneously. Every human being in the conversion zone. Another pause. With the right delivery system and enough Capitron, Nick, everyone, all 11 billion. The coffee on his desk had gone cold. Outside, the transit hub was filling up with the early morning commuters. Workers in green and gray, maintenance crews with their tool satchels. Children in school transit uniforms walking in crooked lines that a distant ancestor would have recognized because children had always walked in crooked lines. The ordinary, miraculous, unremarkable life of a planet that had learned, slowly, painfully over centuries of failure, how to simply be. I'll brief the Great Brother in 15 minutes, Nick said. You need to get somewhere secure. Craspin has a specific reason to want you gone, because I turned him in. Yes, I know. She was already moving toward the door, gathering her own case from the chair where she'd let it. There's a boy I need to find first. Nick looked at her. Tom, she said. He found me this morning before you called. He was waiting outside my building. He does that sometimes. Shows up when something is about to happen, like he knows ahead of time. He knew about the Sigma breach before the alarms went off. He told me he had a feeling, which is what he always says. And I've stopped trying to quantify what he means by a feeling because the data is clear. When he says he has a feeling, he has something that functions at minimum like accurate foreknowledge. She reached the door. I don't know what he is, Nick. I don't know where he came from or what his abilities actually are. But I've learned not to argue with his feelings. The boy was 11 years old, or appeared to be. He had appeared in Metropolis 3 years ago without papers or registered history, taken in by one of the wandering communities of scholars who operated outside the city's formal registration system. A tradition old enough that Council had stopped trying to regulate it. He had large dark eyes with a quality of stillness in them that didn't belong to a child. Not the stillness of vacancy, but the stillness of something very concentrated. He could sometimes do things that Barbara couldn't explain, and she was a woman who had built her career on explaining things. "Find him," Nick said. "Stay with him. Stay off the main transit lines." She nodded, then stopped in the doorway without turning. Nick, whoever he targets for conversion, whoever Craspin chooses as his first subject, they won't know what's happening to them. They'll just be going about their lives, flying a route, running a patrol. And then, she stopped. The sentence finished itself in the space she left it. "Just find them before it gets too far. Whatever it gets to." "I will," Nick said. He believed it when he said it. Golab had been a police inspector for 16 years, which was long enough to have lost most of his illusions about the job, and short enough that he still sometimes felt something like pride about it. He was enormous. That was simply the first fact about him that people registered, usually from a startled step back. 6'6", 270 pounds, shoulders that required him to turn sideways through standard gauge corridor hatches. He had a beard that had gone more gray than brown in the last 3 years, and hands that could bend patrol-grade steel cable if he applied himself. His face was not an unfriendly face, but it was a large one, and the way he stood, the particular balance of someone who has long since accepted spatial impact they have on any room they enter, could read as imposing to people who hadn't spent time with him. People who had spent time with him knew that he hummed, quietly, under his breath, old songs from the early settlement period when the planet still went by its original name, and the songs were about the sea, which no longer existed in the form those songs described. He wasn't always aware he was doing it. It happened when he was focused, when he was comfortable, when a task was going well. His commanding officer years ago had once described it as the audio equivalent of a cat's purr, and Golab had never forgiven her for it, mostly because she wasn't wrong. He had been recruited to the security force out of a deep space freight run when he was 26. A commanding officer had seen him lift a seized cargo container off a trapped crew member with his bare hands and decided that a man who could do that should be pointing his capabilities at something more purposeful. He had spent 8 years in ground operations before requesting the transfer to solo patrol. His superiors had not understood the request. He had been one of their best tactical assets. He was difficult to argue with and difficult to stop, and he had an uncanny ability to read a situation's physical geometry that made him invaluable in close-quarters operations. He had explained carefully that he wasn't good at being in groups, that the solo patrol routes had something that ground operations didn't. They had tried twice to refuse the transfer. He had filled out the forms twice more. On the third submission, they had transferred him with the specific, resigned quality of institutions acknowledging that some arguments are over before they begin. He flew solo patrol routes now in a light-class security vessel, which was a compromise between what his superiors wanted him to do and what he was temperamentally suited for. The routes took him out to the edge of the mapped sectors and back, long sweeping arcs through transit corridors that were mostly empty, occasionally populated by freight haulers and scientific vessels, and the rare, diplomatic transit that required a security escort he was technically assigned to provide but practically never had to. He was good at flying. He was good at being alone. He was good at the long, quiet distances between checkpoints, where it was just him and the instrumentation and the drift of stars on the view screen, and Kip sitting in the co-pilot cradle with his indicator lights cycling amber-green amber in the particular pattern that meant the little machine was content. Kip was a Type 3 companion unit, which was the technical designation for what was essentially a robot dog. He had 4 articulated legs and a sensor array built into the housing where a nose would have been, and a tail that moved in response to proximity, readings from people he had been calibrated to recognize as friendly. He was 40 centimeters tall and 18 kilograms, and had processing capabilities that the equipment division had upgraded 3 times without Golab's knowledge, on the theory that the man would never voluntarily submit Kip for maintenance. They were right about that, but they did it anyway on the rare occasions when Golab left the ship, and Kip was accessible without the political complexity of the inspector himself. The security force had issued him to Golab 11 years ago as a diagnostic support unit, and Golab had kept him ever since, resisting 3 separate attempts by the equipment division to requisition the aging hardware for an upgrade to a newer model. The equipment division had eventually given up. They had put a note in his file that read, under the subject heading of Companion Unit Disposition, inspection assets have been determined to be non-retrievable. The inspector has expressed a strong preference for continuation of the existing assignment. All further upgrade requests have been withdrawn pending the retirement or death of either party. They had used the word death with the resigned bureaucratic resignation of people who know they are losing a slow-motion argument with physics and personal loyalty combined. Golab had never read the note. He wouldn't have cared. Kip was his. He was running a standard sweep of the Sigma-adjacent transit corridors, not assigned to Sigma specifically, just overlapping by the outer edge of his route when the alert came in, not through his comm channel. That would have been normal, would have been the kind of thing he processed and responded to in the ordinary rhythm of the work. It came through Kip, which was not. Kip's indicator lights snapped from amber-green-amber to red-red-red in a sequence that had no designation in the standard diagnostic manual. Golab had only seen it once before, on a deep space incident 8 years ago that he didn't like thinking about, in a transit corridor where something had been waiting that wasn't on any chart, and the only warning they'd had was Kip going red before the instruments caught up. He had survived that incident. He had learned to trust the red. He straightened in his seat. "What is it, boy?" Kip chattered in the rapid click frequency that meant proximity alarm, but the ship's own sensor array was showing nothing. Clear space, standard transit lane, standard radiation background, no vessel signatures within detection range. The instruments were reading clean. The instruments were lying. He had his hands on the evasion controls before the thought was fully formed. Not conscious calculation, but muscle memory. 19 years of it, the body deciding faster than the mind. He pitched the nose 15 degrees to starboard and kicked the thrust asymmetrically, and the ship yawed hard. Left, which was ugly flying, but ugly flying was sometimes the difference. Not enough. The Capitron missile had been fired from deep stealth approach at point-blank range, which meant even the 15-degree pitch was only a partial dodge. It was enough to keep the missile from striking the drive section, which would have killed him instantly. Instead, it struck the mid-hull, and what happened next was not the impact of a conventional warhead. There was no explosion, no heat, no fragmentation. What happened was that the missile passed through the hull as if the hull were a suggestion rather than a barrier, and what was inside it passed through Golab the same way. He had time to grab Kip, one instinctive motion, hauling the little machine to his chest, one arm locked around him, before the light took everything. He was thinking, in the last fragment of cognitive clarity before the Capitron rewrote him. The dog. Keep the dog safe. Whatever happens, keep Kip. The light didn't end so much as change texture. He was on a table. He knew it was a table because he could feel the edges of it, cool against his palms. He could feel his palms. He could feel his hands. He conducted full-body inventory of sensation with a terrible, methodical clarity that felt borrowed from somewhere, as if his nervous system was testing its own new architecture. His skin felt too tight, like wearing something a size too small. His vision was fractured at the edges, like looking through a cracked lens. Not painful, just wrong. The wrong quality of spatial information arriving from the wrong angle. The room was dimly lit with a reddish cast and smelled of chemical compounds he couldn't identify, and there were 2 people standing at a console on the far side of it. One was a thin man with a white coat and the specific posture of someone who had spent 40 years hunched over laboratory instruments. He had thin white hair brushed carefully back from a face that was all angles and precision, the face of someone who had decided, somewhere in middle age, that other people's feelings were a variable not worth including in his calculations. He was watching readouts on a screen with the focused intensity of a craftsman examining the best work he had produced in years. His name, Golab would later understand, was Dr. Craspin, and the expression on his face was satisfaction, which was exactly and entirely the wrong emotion for this room. The other person was harder to look at directly, not because of any trick of the light, but because she was beautiful in a way that felt engineered rather than grown, a face that had been maintained, with such obsessive, centuries-long care that it had become somehow more unsettling than natural aging would have produced. Long dark hair, dark eyes, a posture of absolute ownership of every room she had ever stood in. 200 years of practiced arrogance, Golab would later learn. 200 years of keeping herself beautiful by expending other people. Lady Agatha. He didn't know the name yet, but he knew the posture. He had arrested people who stood like that, and they all had the same quality: the absolute, unexamined certainty that consequences applied to everyone except them. He tried to sit up. His body responded differently than it should have, with a speed and force that was not his own, or rather that was his own in some horrifying amplified form. His torso came off the table in a single motion, and he was standing, and the table was behind him, and neither Craspin nor Agatha looked surprised. Craspin looked, if anything, pleased. He made a small notation on his console. "Excellent," Craspin said. "The integration is complete. Structural cohesion is better than the models projected. Reflex speed is exceptional. This one is everything we needed, my lady." "He'd better be," she said. She had a voice like cold water over stone. "Grell wants him operational within the hour. He's been patient long enough." Golab tried to say something. He opened his mouth and his voice worked. He could hear it, but the words were coming from a distance, like someone else was operating the mechanism of his speech. Something was wrong with the connection between the thought and the saying of it. He said slowly, with enormous effort, each word separated from the next by the distance of pushing it through something thick. "Where is my ship?" Craspin looked at him with the slight curiosity of a man who has expected a result and is mildly interested to see how much of the original substrate remains. "Gun," he said without looking up from his screens. "Salvageable but irrelevant. You have a new purpose now, Inspector." A pause. The specific kind of pause that contains a point being made. "Or rather, you have a purpose. The old one is largely unavailable to you." He reached for a panel on the wall. Golab understood in the last coherent moment before the chip in his prefrontal cortex was activated that he should be afraid. That fear was the appropriate human response to this situation. He searched for it. He found something that might have been its shadow, faint and far away. A distant, urgent signal from the part of him that remembered who he was. The part that flew solo patrol routes. The part that hummed old songs about the sea. The part that had once lifted a cargo container off a trapped crew member with his bare hands, not because he'd been ordered to, but because there was a person under it, and that was enough of a reason. He found that part and it was still there, small and distant and still there. Craspin touched the panel, and then that part went somewhere it couldn't speak from. The first Nick heard of it was the emergency beacon. He was in the Great Brother's briefing room when it came through. A distress signal from Golab's vessel, fragmented, partially corrupted by hull damage, but with enough coherent data to reconstruct what had happened. The patrol ship was drifting in the Sigma-adjacent corridor with catastrophic hull penetration, biosigns absent, not dead. The instruments insisted with the particular precision of instruments that had been designed to distinguish between those two states. Not dead but absent, which was a category that required explanation. Evidence of a Capitron discharge at close range was unambiguous. Kip's emergency transmitter was still active, pulsing from somewhere on or near the drifting vessel, cycling its distress code in the patient way that machines continued doing things long after the circumstances that required them had changed entirely. Nick stared at the data for a long time. He had known Golab for 11 years. Not well. Golab resisted being known well in the specific way of people who have decided that their inner life is their own business and they will share it on their own terms or not at all. But well enough to know that the man was, at his core, profoundly decent. Quiet and enormous and quietly decent, which was a combination that Nick had learned not to take for granted. The kind of person who showed up every day and did the work and went home and did it again, who kept a robot dog and resisted equipment division requisitions and hummed old songs during the long, quiet stretches of solo patrol. They used him, Nick said, to no one in particular. The Great Brother was an old man with the drawn, precise face of someone who had spent decades making decisions he knew would hurt someone, and had learned to be at peace with that without being indifferent to it. He sat at the head of the briefing table and looked at the data without expression. "Craspin's first test subject," he said. "The conversion requires someone with sufficient physical baseline for the Capitron to produce a viable weapon. Inspector Golab's service file would have been accessible to Grawl through his former council contacts. His metrics are exceptional." He paused. "I'm sorry, Nick." Nick filed that away. He would feel it later when there was room for feeling. "How long before Craspin can produce more?" he asked. "Unknown. The Capitron yield from the Sigma breach suggests he could produce additional conversion missiles within days, given sufficient substrate subjects. But the immediate problem is the one he's already made." The immediate problem arrived 12 hours later. Nick was at the West Transit Hub, running the evacuation coordination for the residential sector closest to the Great Brothers complex, when the alarms went off. Not the standard emergency frequency, but the deep, resonant pulse that meant a breach at the central complex level, which was the pulse that security officers trained for and hoped never to hear in practice. He ran. He was not the only one running. Every available officer in the district was in motion, which should have been enough. In any normal threat scenario, the combined response of the Metropolis Security Force would have been more than enough. But Golob, the thing Golob had become, was not a normal threat scenario. Nick rounded the corner into the Great Brothers residential corridor and stopped. Golob was at the far end of it, 40 meters away. What Golob had been was somewhere inside the enormous thing at the far end of the corridor. You could see it in the frame, in the bone structure, in the particular width of the hands that Nick had known for 11 years. The beard was gone and the skin had a quality to it that wasn't quite right. A density and sheen that spoke of something that had happened at the cellular level and hadn't finished happening. He was moving with the methodical deliberateness of someone executing a specific set of instructions, and the instructions did not include stopping for obstacles. Nick stepped forward. "Golob," he said. The thing at the end of the corridor turned its head. Its eyes found him with a targeting precision that was nothing like the way Golob had ever looked at him. And then, for just a moment so brief that Nick would question later whether he had imagined it, something else crossed those eyes, something that recognized him from underneath the mechanism. A signal from the planet that had gone dark. A flicker. Nick had exactly enough time to open his mouth to say something else. 3 security force officers came through the side corridor and opened fire. The moment was gone. Conventional weapons. Nick had time to think the words with the specific resigned clarity of a man watching something he had warned about happen anyway. Had time to think that Craspin had understood exactly what he was doing and had accounted for exactly this. As the shots that would have stopped any normal human threat dissipated against the converted structure of Golob's forearm, and Golob's arm swept sideways, and the officers scattered and Nick was running. He ran for 6 blocks through the transit corridors before he understood he wasn't being pursued and stopped, hands on his knees, breathing. Then he stood back up. He thought about the flicker in Golob's eyes. He thought about what Barbara had said. They won't know what's happening to them. He thought about the emergency beacon still cycling from the drifting patrol ship, Kip's patient distress code pulsing into the void. He decided that the flicker mattered. Tom was exactly where Barbara had said he would be, in the old scholars' quarter in the Eastern District, sitting cross-legged on a wall above the canal, with his eyes partly closed and his hands resting palm up on his knees in a posture that would have looked meditative on an adult and looked deeply incongruous on an 11-year-old boy. Watching the morning canal traffic, he opened his eyes when Nick's footsteps were still 50 meters away. Not startled, just ready. "You found her?" Nick asked, coming up to the wall. "She's safe," Tom said. "Growl's people came to her building this morning. I moved her." "Where?" "You'll see her soon. She's in the archive district, in the old library node, the lower level. Craspin's people don't know about it." He said all of this without particular alarm, factually, the way a child described things they had processed past the point of fear. "She's been working since I brought her there. She told me not to interrupt her." "That sounds right." Nick leaned against the wall. Tom. "Golob came through the complex." "I know." A pause. "He didn't hurt you. He wasn't trying to. He had specific instructions. But he hurt 3 officers, and he's out there somewhere now. And Craspin has him on a short leash." Nick looked at the canal. The ordinary morning canal, barges moving through the reflect of the early sky. "Can you reach him? If we got close enough, can you get through whatever the chip is doing?" Tom considered this with his eyes partly closed again, as if the question required him to consult something internal that needed quiet to be heard. "I think so," he said finally. "I've done something like it before, with smaller things. The chip creates a suppression field around his higher cognition. It's not that he's gone, it's that the chip is speaking louder than he can. If I can quiet the chip, even briefly, he can surface. And if Barbara has what she's building," he opened his eyes, "the compound she's working on, it can help him hold on to himself once he surfaces. The chip can't re-drown him if he's already coming back." "How do you know what she's working on?" "She told me. She was talking through her process when I brought her to the library node. She does that. Talks through her thinking." A slight pause. "She's very good, Nick. The compound she's designing, it should work. The biochemistry is correct. He said it with the flat certainty of a child confirming the answer on a homework problem. Nick looked at him. The particular, unsettling experience of being in a conversation with Tom. "There's something else," the boy said. "The travelers told me about the missile." Nick went very still. "What missile?" "Craspin has a large dispersal missile in his facility on Noxon, fully armed, programmed for Metropolis. The warhead carries a Capitron charge sufficient to convert everyone in the primary impact zone." He paused. "Everyone, Nick. All of them." Nick looked at the canal. The light on it. The ordinary beautiful light on the water that did not care what was being said above it. "We need to go to Noxon," he said. "I know," Tom said. "I packed." He picked up his bag from the wall beside him. 3 items. Nick had come to believe that this was all the boy ever needed. Getting to Noxon required a ship, and getting a ship required navigating the bureaucratic mechanisms of an organization currently in emergency lockdown mode, which was, as bureaucratic obstacles went, particularly resistant to informal approaches. Nick spent 2 hours calling in the specific variety of favors that can only be accumulated over 19 years of careful professional loyalty. He called the transit clearance officer, who owed him from the Cassian incident 3 years ago. He called the hangar supervisor, who he had once spent 4 hours helping extract from a situation involving a property dispute and a malfunctioning atmospheric seal. He called the fuel allocation coordinator by name, which almost nobody did, and asked for what he needed in the specific tone of a person who is not making a demand but is also not really making a request. By the end of the 2 hours, he had a medium-class interceptor with a full fuel load and a clearance for outbound Vector 9 departure, and the clearance was technically in the name of a freight inspection operation that he would need to retroactively file the paperwork for, which was a problem for a later version of himself. Barbara was waiting at the launch bay. She had her case, which contained her synthesizer kit and everything she needed to complete the reversal compound in a functional laboratory, and she had the specific appearance of someone who has been working under pressure for hours and has achieved something but needs more time to be sure. Tom was beside her. Kip was not yet. "Gross people came to my lab," Barbara said, falling into step beside him as he moved toward the interceptor. "They weren't looking for data. Whatever data Craspin had, Grawl already has it. They were looking for me specifically. They went through my personal workstation. They left it running, which was careless or deliberate. I couldn't tell which." "It was deliberate," Nick said. "They wanted you to know they'd been there. They wanted you to run. They wanted me frightened." "Are you?" A brief pause. "I'm very busy," she said, which was a different answer than the one he'd asked for and more honest. "Nick, if I can get into Craspin's lab on Noxon, if I can access his synthesis equipment, I think I can complete the reversal compound there. The theoretical framework is solid, the biochemical logic holds. The Capitron mutation isn't permanent on its own. It's energetically unstable. It has to constantly consume cellular resources to maintain itself, which is part of why it degrades higher cognition. The brain is being used as a power source. If I can synthesize the correct interruption compound and administer it, the cellular structure will begin re-establishing its baseline. Given time." She paused. "It will take time. It won't be instant, but it will work. You've been running this analysis for 8 hours on your own, and you already have a theoretical reversal compound." "I've been running it for longer than that," she said quietly. "I wrote the original humanoid project analysis 5 years ago. I've thought about reversal since then, not because I thought it would be needed. She stopped. Just because I needed to know it was possible, that it wasn't permanent, that you couldn't take a person and keep them taken." Nick didn't say anything for a moment. "It's possible," she said. "I need a lab. Hence Noxon. They boarded the ship. Tom, climbing the ramp ahead of them, said without turning, "We should get the dog first." "What dog?" Nick said. "Kip, his beacon is still transmitting from the patrol ship. He's been waiting." Nick looked at Barbara. She looked back at him. "We go for the dog," Nick said. They diverted 11 minutes out of Noxon Vector to match course with Golob's abandoned patrol vessel. The ship had taken catastrophic damage. Hull blistered across the midsection, drive section entirely dark, the telltale subsurface burns of a Capitron hit showing the characteristic pattern of a charge that had passed through rather than exploded on. The kind of damage that made the incident clear at a glance even without the sensor data. They came alongside it in the slow, careful way you approach something damaged, and Nick locked the intercept umbilical to the forward hatch and they went across. The forward compartment was intact. sealed against space by emergency pressure containment. It was cold and dark, and the emergency lighting had gone to its lowest power level. Nick could see through the inner viewport, the co-pilot cradle, and in it the amber-green-amber cycling of Kip's indicator lights. They got the hatch open. Lights in the compartment shifted when the hatch moved, cycling through something faster and more complex than the standard amber-green-amber, a rapid flickering sequence that didn't match any pattern in the diagnostic manual. And then, as Nick and Barbara and Tom came through the hatch and the light from the umbilical corridor reached the cradle, the lights settled back to amber-green-amber. Tom crossed the damaged deck in 4 steps and crouched down beside the cradle. He put one hand on top of Kip's casing. For a moment he was still in that concentrated, complete way he had. "He's all right," the boy said. "He's been all right the whole time." He was waiting for Galab. When Galab didn't come back, he stayed at the post. A pause. He knew someone would come eventually. He waited. Tom picked Kip up with both arms, the machine's 4 legs dangling with the loose articulation of something not currently locomoting, and carried him back through the hatch. Nick watched this and felt something that was not complicated enough to have a specific name, but resided in the general territory of things being the way they should be. In the interceptor, Kip settled into the secondary cradle and his lights ran amber-green-amber. Noxon was a dead world, or close enough to dead that the difference was academic. Its sky was a flat chemical white. Its surface was pale, rock stripped bare by 3 centuries of extraction operations that had been so thorough they had essentially completed the geological work of time in a fraction of its natural schedule. What remained was the network of underground structures the mining company had built for long-term habitation, multiple levels, independent atmospheric processing, structural integrity designed to outlast the operation that had built them. Graal had chosen it well. The dead planet had a particular advantage. No one who didn't already know you were there had any reason to look. They came in on a low vector under the canyon rim in the pre-dawn window when Noxon's orbital defense systems ran their standard recalibration cycle and had a gap of 11 minutes in their coverage. Barbara had the timing from the old mining surveys. She had done her research on Noxon as part of the original Craspin investigation and had kept it. In the meticulous way she kept all her research, on the grounds that you never knew when something would become relevant again. They were identified on the final approach anyway. Graal's fighters were running a patrol pattern that the old mining surveys didn't include because it hadn't existed when the surveys were made. And the last 40 seconds of descent involved a great deal of evasive maneuvering that the interceptor was not strictly designed for. Nick flew it hard and low and dirty, and he used the canyon walls for cover twice. And on the 3rd pass, a shot clipped the aft attitude thruster, and the landing became a controlled crash. Controlled in that they all survived it. A crash in that the ship would not be leaving Noxon under its own power. The landing site was a flat expanse of pale rock 3 kilometers from the facility's main entrance, and the ship was mostly intact, which Nick counted as a success under the circumstances. Tom unbuckled his harness before the dust had settled and stood in the tilted cabin with the equilibrium of someone who had been in worse situations. "Close," he observed. "Yes," Nick agreed. "We should move quickly. They'll have the crash site on sensors within minutes." Nick looked at Barbara. She was already gathering her synthesizer kit, her hands moving with efficient precision over the case fastenings, running the same systematic check she ran on everything. Confirm contents, confirm integrity, confirm what she would need and what she had. She met his eyes briefly over the case. "I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready since the library node." Kip climbed out of the cradle and walked to the base of the ramp, sensor array oriented forward toward the chemical white pre-dawn of Noxon's surface, tail in the amber-green-amber of a machine ready to work. They went out into the cold. The facility entrance was sealed with security systems layered over the original mining infrastructure, and the original infrastructure was good. It had been built to last centuries, and it had. But facilities that have been in operation for 2 years accumulate the specific vulnerability of any living system. The people inside them develop routines, and routines are a kind of blueprint. Kip went first, moving ahead at the edge of sensor range in the low, careful way that the Type 3 companion unit was theoretically designed for diagnostic support, but practically suited for something closer to scouting. He had 4 legs and a low center of gravity, and a sensor array that could detect biological signatures through a meter of rock. and he moved through the pale Noxan surface terrain without disturbing it in any measurable way. He found them a way in through the secondary atmospheric exchange. Not a glamorous entrance, a maintenance crawl space, cold and low, smelling of recycled air and machinery. But it connected to the main infrastructure at the third underground level, which was exactly where Barbara needed to be. Inside, the facility was quieter than Nick had expected. There was the background hum of a working installation, power systems, atmospheric processing, the distant rhythms of occupied levels above and below them. But the third level appeared to be primarily storage and laboratory space, and it was between shifts, 2 corridors of shadow, cold blue emergency lighting, the distant sound of a patrol passing on the level above, steady footsteps that tracked overhead and then diminished. Kip led them away from 2 more patrol patterns, twice going completely still at a junction, and waiting with the machine patience of something that has no anxiety about waiting, and then backtracking them a full level once when his sensor array read a sweep pattern they hadn't accounted for. Tom moved behind the machine with his own particular quiet, and Barbara with the focused efficiency of someone in a high-stakes problem she had already partially solved, and Nick with the specific controlled vigilance of 19 years of security force training, applied to a situation that was well outside any protocol he'd been trained to. They found the laboratory. Barbara opened the door with the access codes from her original investigation 4 years ago, and the door opened. Craspin had changed the facility, and changed the equipment, and changed the scope of his ambition, but he had not changed a single access parameter. His operational security was exactly what she had always thought it was. The blind spot of a man who trusted his own genius completely and could not imagine that the same creativity he brought to his science could be turned against him. Inside, the lab was cold and blue-lit and full of equipment that Barbara moved through with the systematic speed of someone who knows exactly where to look in a space they haven't been in before. She went bench to bench, reading labels and configurations, building her map of what was there and what she could use. Nick stood at the door and kept watch. Tom sat on the floor against the far wall with Kip in his lap, both hands flat on the machine's casing, eyes partly closed. Listening? Nick asked quietly, watching the corridor. Feeling, Tom said. He's in the facility, below us. They've got him in a containment level. I think they've been running tests. Checking the integration. A pause, long enough that Nick looked back. He's very far back. The chip is very loud, Nick. He can't get above it. But he's there. What does that feel like? From here? Tom considered the question with his eyes still partly closed. Like someone in a room with all the doors locked and all the lights off. You can hear them, very faintly if you're quiet enough. They're still in there. They haven't stopped moving. They're just a pause. Trying to remember where the door is. Nick turned back to the corridor. 40 minutes. He counted them in the way he had learned to count time in security force operations. Not by watching it, but by working in it. Keeping his breathing even, keeping his focus distributed across the corridor's visual range, not letting the waiting turn into tension because tension was the enemy of the long operations. You breathed, you watched, you stayed ready. Got it, Barbara said. He turned. She was holding a loaded synthesis injector, small and practical, built for single-use field administration. The compound inside it was a pale amber that caught the blue lab light. She held it up and looked at it for a moment with an expression that was not triumph. It was the specific, serious satisfaction of solving a problem that needed to be solved. This is theoretical, she said. I want to be honest about that. The biochemical logic is sound, and I have every reason to believe the compound will interrupt the Capitron cascade and allow the cellular structure to begin re-establishing its baseline. But I won't know for certain until it's been administered to the specific subject. She lowered the injector. The chip is a separate problem. The chip needs to be physically removed or disabled. What the compound can do is give him enough of himself back to work with us, to hold on once Tom quiets the chip. But the quieting has to come first. Tom, Nick said. Can you do it when we're close enough? The boy opened his eyes. He had the expression of someone returning from a great distance. Yes, he said, I can do it. A pause. He's ready to come back. He's been ready the whole time. He just needs someone to make enough space for him to move. The containment level was 4 floors below the lab, accessed through maintenance routes that Kip navigated with the unhurried certainty of a machine that processes physical space differently than biological organisms do. There were no instinct or anxiety in Kip's navigation, just the sensor array reading the geometry, the legs placing themselves with mathematical precision, the periodic still and wait at sensor sweeps that were as regular as any industrial facility, and therefore as predictable. 2 checkpoints, both handled by the combination of Golob's changed body and the operational security gaps that a facility run by a man who trusted his own genius had accumulated. Nick noted, with professional respect, that the converted body's impact on a checkpoint situation was essentially the same as a significant structural hazard. The guards at the first checkpoint saw what was coming and made the correct tactical decision to not be in the corridor when it arrived. Nick didn't blame them. The third obstacle was a pressure door with biometric locks that required Tom. He approached it, placed both palms flat on the surface, and stood very still. Nick stood behind him and watched the corridor and was aware, in his peripheral attention, of something that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite sensation, but was something the body registered and the conscious mind didn't have full vocabulary for. The sense of something very old and very patient working through a medium it understood better than he did. The door opened with the sound of a held breath releasing. The chamber beyond was large and high-ceilinged and lit from above by work lights that cast clean industrial shadows. In its center, standing in the absolute stillness of something awaiting instructions was Golob. He was changed. Not unrecognizably, the frame was his, the architecture of him was his, the specific width of shoulder, and the hands that could bend patrol-grade steel cable. But the beard was gone and the skin had the wrong quality, the density and particular shine of the conversion at work. And the presence was entirely different from the man Nick had known. There was no private steadiness in him, no quiet. The chip on his forehead caught the light, small, flush with the skin, a tiny indicator light on its surface cycling in some pattern that had nothing to do with any system Golob had chosen. His eyes found them when they came through the door. They tracked with the mechanical precision of targeting. Nick walked toward him. "Golob," he said. No response. The targeting precision maintained. 40 meters. 30. "I know you're in there," Nick said, still walking, keeping his pace even and unhurried. The pace of someone who is not afraid. "I know it because I saw it. In the corridor on Metropolis, when the security force came around the corner, there was mortar before they opened fire. And you looked at me, and it wasn't the chip looking at me. That was you. 20 meters. I'm not going to lie and tell you I know what the last few days have been like. I don't know that. But I know what Tom said, and I know what Barbara built, and I know that Kip has been waiting on that ship since the moment you didn't come back, because that's what Kip does. He waits. He knows you're worth waiting for." 15 meters. The targeting quality in Golob's eyes shifted, slightly, barely perceptibly, like the first movement of a locked door. "I'm going to need you to be in there," Nick said. "As much of you as you can find. Be in there. That's all I'm asking." Tom sat down cross-legged on the chamber floor. He took a slow breath. He placed his hands on his knees, palm up, and he said something that was not a language Nick could name. It existed somewhere under language, in the register of things that predate the specific words humans have developed for them, an old phrase that was old enough to predate Metropolis, and predate the Council, and predate Earth's most recent name for itself. Something that moved through the air of the chamber the way music moves at its best. Not describing an emotion, but creating the condition for one. The indicator light on the chip in Golob's forehead went dark. It happened without drama. A light that had been on was off. That was all. But in the silence following it, in the stillness of the chamber, something changed in Golob's face. The vast mechanical distance in his eyes, the faraway quality, the pushed-back quality of a consciousness running below the surface of its own. Skull moved, came closer, surfaced. Barbara was beside Nick in 3 steps. The injector was in her hand and against the side of Golob's neck and fired in one smooth motion, practiced in a library node over the previous 12 hours, executed now with the specific economy of someone who has prepared thoroughly for a thing and does not need to think about the preparation when the thing arrives. "It'll take a few minutes to propagate through the system," she said. "Stay with us. You need to stay with us." Golob looked at her. His mouth worked. The muscles of his face were moving through something, renegotiating, re-establishing connections, the physiological corollary of the thing Tom had done. He said slowly, with the effort of something very large coming back up from a very deep place. "I remember." "I know," she said. "Stay with us. You're doing it." Kip crossed the chamber floor from the doorway where Nick had left him. His lights were running the fast, unreadable sequence that didn't match any diagnostic manual. The sequence Nick had seen when they'd opened the patrol ship's hatch. The sequence that apparently meant something beyond the standard diagnostic vocabulary. He moved in the precise, unhurried way of a machine that has been waiting for this specific moment across several days and several 100 million kilometers, and has arrived at it with all the patience it needed. He reached Golob's side and pushed his sensor array against the back of Golob's hand, and Golob looked down. Nick had made a decision, before entering the chamber, that he would not observe the next moment, that it was private in a way that his profession and his pragmatism had no claim on. He kept his eyes on the door. He heard Golob say, in a voice that was fully, completely, entirely his own, "Kip." He kept watching the door. The alarms went off 4 minutes later. Nick had known they were on a countdown since the moment Kraskorben's patrol pattern had missed them at the 3rd underground level. Not because they'd been detected then, but because a facility this size, with this much operational investment, had redundancies, and redundancies meant that the absence of expected signals was itself a signal. Someone, somewhere, had noticed that a door had been opened that shouldn't have been. He took point at the corridor entrance and ran a rapid assessment of what they had. Golob was 3 minutes into the reversal compound's propagation, partially restored, the distance gone from his eyes, his voice his, the essential architecture of him back in residence, not at full restoration. The conversion wasn't simply going to reverse in 3 minutes. That would take weeks of careful biochemical work and rest and time. What they had was Golob present in his own body, with his own faculties, with the physical capabilities the conversion had granted him intact, and an increasing ability to apply them with his own judgment rather than Kraspin's instructions. They had Barbara with a synthesizer kit and the compound already administered, and the scientific expertise that had made the whole thing possible. They had Tom, who was standing up from the chamber floor and brushing dust off his knees with the unhurried composure of a child finishing a task. They had Kip, whose lights were amber-green amber. They had Nick himself, with a service weapon and 19 years of security force experience, which included specific training in facility breaches and hostile extractions, that he was going to apply to the current situation in a slightly different direction than the training had been designed for. "The missile," Nick said. "Where is it?" Tom looked up, not at the ceiling, at some interior geography only he could read. 6th level. Growl's command center. "The launch shaft is adjacent." "Can you walk?" Nick asked Golob. Golob looked at him. His eyes were fully his now, the mechanical distance entirely resolved, the private steadiness re-established, the man who had been pushed back to the bottom of himself in his own skull, now simply standing in his own face. "I can do considerably more than walk," Golob said. "Good. Then let's move." The way up through a facility in active alert was a different geometry than the way down. The patrol patterns consolidated rather than dispersed, moving toward the disturbance rather than away from it, and the corridors that had been quiet an hour ago were now occupied in ways that required constant reassessment. Nick tracked it as he moved. The vectors, the timing, the particular calculus of an operation where the objective had shifted from infiltration to extraction under pressure. The first 2 checkpoints they encountered were handled by Golob, not in the way that the Golob of the last few days had handled obstacles, with the indiscriminate mechanical force of a weapon doing what it had been aimed at. These were handled with the specific, calibrated judgment of a 16-year police inspector who knew exactly how much was necessary and exactly when to stop. Nick watched it and felt the distinction, felt the difference between a weapon and a person who happened to be very hard to stop, and noted it as something he would carry. The third obstacle was a sealed level door with a sensor network that Kip mapped in approximately 90 seconds and Tom bypassed in another 45. The fourth was a patrol of 6 officers who were not expecting what they found and were not prepared for it and chose, with what Nick considered admirable tactical instinct, to clear the corridor. They came up into the facility's upper levels through a service access route that had been built for maintenance and was now serving as the escape route of 4 people and 1 machine who had come a very long way to prevent a missile from flying. Growl's command center was at the highest occupied level, a wide, high-ceilinged room with a panoramic viewport onto the canyon landscape of Noxon, the pale surface lit by a sun that had no name because no one who lived there had ever needed to give it one. Banks of instrumentation lined the walls. In the center of the room, elevated on a slight platform, was the primary control station, and the launch shaft schematics were visible on the panel beside the door. And the missile they could not let fly was in that shaft, fueled and armed and waiting. Grawl was standing at the primary control station. He was a tall man, dressed in the way that men who have constructed their grievance into an ideologies sometimes dressed, as though the quality of the clothes could make the resentment official. Dark layered armor, the helmet set aside on the console beside him, his face visible, his brother's face, or what his brother's face might have become if it had spent 20 years being polished by exile into something angular and cold. He had the specific self-possession of someone who had spent so long inside his own narrative that he had forgotten other people had narratives too. He looked at Nick when they came through the door and he smiled, not warmly. "You're very persistent," he said. "I've heard that about you. I thought Golob would have handled you in the corridor on Metropolis." "He didn't," Nick said. "I can see that." His eyes moved to Golob, and the smile held, but the eyes were doing something different. Rapid assessment, recalculation, the specific look of someone determining whether a variable they believed they controlled has moved outside their model. He's been partially restored. Craspin is not going to be pleased. Where is Craspin? In a sub-basement. He doesn't enjoy what he calls confrontation, which mostly means he doesn't enjoy being in rooms where people might hit him. A gesture. He prefers to send things. The missile. The missile. Grawl turned to look at the control station with the expression of a man looking at the culmination of 20 years of nursing a grievance into the shape of an action. "You understand what it will do." Your Dr. Gibson explained it. I assume, in whatever analysis she wrote that got Craspin committed. Every human being in Metropolis, Nick, converted, all 11 billion of them, under my direction, under my care. He looked back. My brother built a planet and called it Peace. He put a name on it like a label on a box and said, "This is what we are now, Metropolis," as if the name was enough. As if you could paper over 11 billion years of human violence with good governance and clean transit and vertical gardens. He paused. "I'm going to finish the project. Take away the capacity for the violence. Keep everything else. It's not," he stopped. "It's not hatred, Nick. I want you to understand that. It's architecture. It's murder," Nick said. 11 billion individual murders conducted simultaneously. You don't get to call it architecture because you're doing them all at once. Or liberation. Those aren't different things. That's the thing people like you never understand. When you take away what makes the choice possible, you take away the person who could choose. There's no liberation in that. There's just removal. Grawl's hand moved toward the launch control. 3 things happened simultaneously. Tom, who had separated from the group in the first moments of entering the command center, moving along the far wall with a quiet that nobody had tracked. Tom reached the missile control panel, placed both palms flat on its surface, and the launch sequence countdown that Nick hadn't known was already running stuttered to a halt on the secondary display. Tom's eyes closed. His lips moved in something below sound. Grawl's gauntlet fired, not at Nick, not at Golob, but at Tom, the one person in the room who was disabling the only thing Grawl had spent 20 years building toward. Golob moved. It was not the speed of the weapon he had been 3 days ago. It was not the speed of a man of his size, which was already considerable. It was something else, the product of both, the gap between the categories, a speed that belonged to neither one, and occupied the space where the categories ended. He crossed the command center in the time it took the laser beam to leave the gauntlet and reach the trajectory of its target, and he was in that trajectory, and the beam dissipated against his forearm without penetrating because the conversion's physical changes had not reversed, would not reverse for weeks, and in this specific moment that fact was working in exactly the right direction. He looked at his arm. He looked at Grawl. He walked forward. Grawl fired again. The beam scattered across the converted skin. He fired a 3rd time, recalibrating with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a man who had invested heavily in weapons that were now demonstrably not working, and put everything the gauntlet had into a sustained burst that would have cut through structural steel, and it met Golob's forward motion without effect, and Golob kept walking, and the distance between them collapsed. Grawl took 1 step back, then another. His expression passed through several things very quickly. Recalculation, adjustment, the specific moment when a model fails to account for a variable and the person running the model has to decide whether to acknowledge it or not. He reached for the launch control directly, bypassing the panel Tom was working on, going for the manual secondary. Nick was at his flank. Nick had his service weapon in a 2-handed grip that incorporated 19 years of practice and a specific, Grounded anger that was not the hot anger of a moment, but the cool anger of a person who has watched something terrible happen to someone who didn't deserve it and has been moving toward this room for 3 days. He did not fire. He leveled the weapon and said, very clearly, the launch sequence. Tom said without opening his eyes, I have it. The warhead is disarmed. The guidance system is interrupted. The launch sequence cannot be reinitiated from any panel in this facility. A pause.
I made sure.
Grawl looked at the panel, at Tom, at Golob, who was standing 3 meters away from him, and had stopped moving because stopping was a choice. And stopping meant he was the one deciding when it was over. At Nick. He looked at all of them for a long moment with an expression that had passed through all its stages and arrived at something on the other side of calculation. You understand this doesn't end here, he said. There are resources you haven't found. There are. Golob stepped forward. He took hold of the armored command core at Graal's chest, the central housing of the gauntlet system, the mechanism of the threat, with one hand, and he applied a specific, deliberate amount of force. The armor crushed. The gauntlet went dark, not brutally, not with rage, with the specific purposeful force of a police inspector who has been doing this work for 16 years and understands exactly when a threat needs to end. Graal, deprived of his weapons system and held firmly by a hand that was not choosing to let go, went still. I think, Golob said, in the voice that was fully and completely his own, unhurried, the voice of a man who had just come back from somewhere very far away and was using the first words that were entirely his to say something that needed to be said. I think that it ends here. Nick lowered his weapon. He let out a breath. Tom opened his eyes. The missile panel beside him was dark. The facility was secured before any Graal loyalists reached the command level. Tom had done something to the missile system that Nick still could not fully explain. The warhead had not merely been disarmed but rendered inert at the component level in a way that the technical team from Metropolis, when they arrived 6 hours later, would spend 2 days trying to understand and ultimately classify as a phenomenon that exceeded the current parameters of known physics. Nick asked Tom about it while they were waiting for the extraction team in the secured command center. Craspin's data already copied to a sealed evidence drive. Graal in restraints against the far wall, watched by 2 repurposed security officers. The pale Noxon Canyon visible through the panoramic viewport as the dead planet's sun moved into something that approximated morning. The travelers helped, Tom said. Who are they? Nick asked. He had asked this before. He asked again because the situation seemed to warrant a more complete answer. Tom thought about it. He was sitting with Kip beside him, one hand resting on the machine's back in the absent way of a child comfortable with a companion. Old, he finally said. Very old. They were here before Metropolis, before the Council, before Earth stopped being called Earth. They've been watching for a very long time. A pause. They like humans. Or something in that register. I'm not sure they experience things the way we do, so like might not be exactly right. But they pay attention to you. Specifically to you. The way you'd pay attention to something that keeps surprising you. What about us surprises them? Tom turned those eyes on him. In the light from the panoramic viewport, with the pale canyon behind him, and the morning on Noxon spreading its cold illumination across the rock, he looked briefly like something other than a child. Not frightening. Just very, very old in a young body, the way some children are. The way some people always are. You keep deciding things matter, he said. Even when nothing requires you to. Even when the situation is designed to make you stop. Even when the chips are in and the lights are out and the room is locked. He paused. You find the door. Not because you're built differently from anything else. There's nothing in your biology that guarantees it. You just decide, again and again, that the person in the locked room is worth going back for. That the thing Craspin made is not what Golob is. That the difference between what someone was and what someone has been turned into is a difference worth spending 3 days and crossing a dead planet to address. He looked back at Kip. The travelers think that's remarkable. I've come to agree with them. Down the corridor, Barbara was at work on Golob, the full reversal synthesis, the chip removal under local sedation, the careful biochemical restoration of a system that had been used as a raw material and was now being given permission to return to itself. Nick had looked in once and seen Golob lying still in the medical chair with the specific quality of a person finally resting, and Kip sitting in his lap because Golob had reached down mid-procedure and picked him up. He hadn't asked her to move the dog. He'd watched her work around it. They brought Grawl back to Metropolis in restraints in the hold of the extraction team's ship, with 3 security force officers assigned to his custody, and a level 5 evidence seal on every piece of equipment and data recovered from the Noxon facility. Craspin was found in a sub-basement laboratory in a state that Nick, in his official report, would describe as attempting to destroy evidence. He had managed to corrupt approximately 12% of his files before the security team reached him. The remaining 88% was comprehensive. The Great Brothers Council would spend the next 8 months working through it. Lady Agatha was found in her chambers in the upper residential level of the facility. She did not resist. She sat in her chair and looked at the security officers who had come for her with an expression that Nick, passing the open door on his way to the extraction staging area, saw for only a moment but would not forget. She looked tired. She looked, finally, her age, which was considerable, in the specific way of someone who has spent 2 centuries keeping themselves from looking it. Not ugly, not ruined, just human. The ordinary human age of a person who has been afraid of what they are for a very long time and has arrived, at last, at the end of the resources they had been spending to avoid it. Nick walked past. He didn't stop. There was nothing he had to say to her that wasn't already in the evidence file, and the evidence file was more honest than anything he might manage in a corridor. He felt something adjacent to pity. He kept moving. The transit home was quiet. Golab sat in the main cabin with Kip on his lap and said nothing for the first 2 hours. And Nick sat across from him and said nothing either, because 2 hours of processing silence was the minimum this situation warranted and pressing. It would have been unkind. He drank his synthetic coffee. He watched the stars on the view screen. He thought, when he let himself, about Marchetti and Park and Velez, and about the families of the 3 officers, and about the work of the weeks ahead. The debrief, the formal investigation, the evidence review, all the procedural architecture that existed to turn a thing that had happened into a record that said it had happened and what it meant. At some point, without announcement, Golab began to speak. "I remember being afraid," he said, "before the chip activated. I was looking for the fear and I found it, just the edge of it, just the shadow, and then it was gone. I know. I could hear things after. While I could hear things. I couldn't act on what I was hearing, but I could hear. The people I encountered, the ones who scattered. I remember all of it." A pause. "I remember the corridor. I remember you. I remember that too," Nick said. "The flicker," Golab said. "Yes, that was," he stopped, started again. "That was all of me that was left that could move, at that point. It was like being in a room and finding one window, and being able to look through it for 1 second, and then the window was gone." He was quiet. But it was enough. I knew someone had seen. "It was enough," Nick confirmed. Another silence. The stars moved. "Is the Great Brother all right?" "He's fine. He was at a secondary complex during the breach. He wants to speak with you when you're ready." Nick paused. "He doesn't hold you responsible for anything that happened. That's official and it's also personal." He said both separately. Golab absorbed this. "I want to fly again," he said. "When the clearance comes through, I want the solo patrol routes. I'll make sure that happens. The equipment division will try to take Kip again," Golab said, "for the upgrade review. I'll stop them." "You shouldn't have to stop them every time." "No," Nick agreed, "but I will." Golab looked at the view screen, the stars, the long, slow, indifferent movement of the universe around the small ship carrying them home. He had the posture of a man who has been somewhere very dark and come back through his own effort and other people's, and has arrived at the other side of it knowing precisely and completely what both contributions cost. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Nick said. "You came back. We just went to get you. Is that different?" "Very." A long pause. "Partially," Golab said. "What?" "I came back partially. TomTom was part of it." "Yes, and Barbara." "Yes, and Kip." Kip's lights cycled amber-green amber. "Yes," Nick said. Golab was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Kip, at the lights cycling in their steady rhythm, at the machine that had waited on a damaged ship in a dead corridor across several 100 million kilometers of space, and had been patient the whole time because that was the nature of the machine and the nature of the relationship between the machine and the man. "Human beings," Golab said, in the tone of someone turning something over, "looking at what it weighs." "What about us?" Nick said. "We keep deciding things matter." He said it slowly, with the specificity of someone arriving at a thought rather than reporting one they already had. "Even when nobody requires it. Even when it would cost less not to." He paused. "Even when the thing has been locked away and the lights are all out." "Yes," Nick said. "We do." Outside, the stars burned their cold, indifferent light across the distances between things, and the ship was a small, warm, moving object carrying its cargo of decisions home through the dark. Tom left 2 days after their return. He came to Barbara's office in the morning and told her, directly, without preamble, that his purpose in Metropolis was complete and that he needed to return to where he came from. He said where he came from was Tibet, in an earlier time, which he acknowledged was not information she could easily process, and was not asking her to. Barbara set down her work and looked at him. She had been at her workstation since before dawn, running the full documentation of the reversal compound, the theoretical framework, the synthesis process, the administration protocols, all of it codified and cross-referenced so that it would exist in the scientific record as something any competent researcher could reproduce. It was careful, specific work, the kind of work that mattered beyond the immediate case, that said, "This can be undone, there is a way back, hold this knowledge. Will you come back?" she asked. Tom considered the question with his particular seriousness. "I don't know," he said. "I think when something like this happens again, when someone decides that people are a resource rather than a fact, I think there will always be someone like me, somewhere, one form or another, showing up when they're needed." He paused. "And people like you and Nick and Galab." "Galab isn't a people like us," she said. "He's a specific phenomenon." "Yes," Tom said, "he is." And the slight curve of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, the precondition for a smile, held for a moment. He picked up his bag, 3 items, exactly the same bag he had arrived with, and walked to the door. He stopped. "You should know," he said, not looking at her, looking at the door's surface, "that the travelers are very pleased. Not because the plan was stopped. They've seen plans stop before. Because of how it was stopped." He turned. "Because Galab came back. Because he was in there, that far back, and he found his way to the surface. Because that is what people do. That specific, stubborn, irrational, completely human thing of deciding that you are still you even when everything around you is designed to make that impossible." He looked at her directly. "That is what makes you worth watching. That is the thing." He was gone before she could answer. She sat in the quiet of her office looking at the door for a while, and then she picked up her work and completed it. 6 weeks later, a medium-class security vessel departed the Metropolis transit hub on Vector 7 at 0630 hours, assigned to standard solo patrol of the Northern Corridor sectors. Its pilot was listed in the departure manifest as Inspector G. Galab status, reinstated full clearance, assigned vessel, light-class solo patrol, co-pilot unit, K3 companion, unit designation KIP. Nick was on the observation level when it left. He watched the launch sequence from the window, the pre-flight checks, the hub clearance, the slow movement away from the dock, and then the acceleration that turned slow movement into the kind of fast that the distance swallowed. He watched the vessel clear the hub and climb and become a point of light, and then become nothing distinguishable from any of the other points of light that occupied the sky above a planet that had been called many things across its history, and was currently called Metropolis, and would probably be called something else before long, because that was what planets did. He stood at the window after the light was gone. He thought about Golab coming back from the bottom of his own skull, finding the locked door from the inside, making his way through it. He thought about Barbara, spending a night in a library archive building a theoretical reversal compound from the inside of a crisis, because she had decided 5 years ago that it needed to be possible and had never let the decision go. He thought about Tom, 11 years old and ancient, showing up when things were terrible, because something somewhere had decided that when things were terrible, there should be someone like Tom in the room. He thought about Kip, cycling green amber in the dark of a damaged ship, patient as only a machine that loves its person can be patient, waiting. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of thing that kept deciding things mattered, even in the converted cellular structure of a person turned into a weapon, even in the dispersal calculations of a man who called mass murder architecture, even in the small moments, the flicker behind Golab's eyes in the corridor, the working of his mouth as he tried to say, "Where is my ship?" The way he had reached down mid-medical procedure and picked up his dog, especially in the small moments. Nick finished his coffee. He went back to work. Below him in the transit hub, the ordinary morning of 11 billion people who hadn't been converted, who were simply themselves in all their unremarkable particularity, moved on the way it always did. Crooked lines of children, workers in green and gray, the light on the vertical garden panels. The world persisting in the specific stubborn way that only worlds that have decided to persist are capable of. The stars burned on above it, cold and indifferent and ancient and entirely unmoved by the small, completely remarkable human decisions being made beneath them. Planet Earth had narrowly escaped disaster. It had a very long history of that.